8 out of 12 UK butter brands tested in this investigation. Wait, no. Let me restart correctly with the bread script. Bread and Flour Regulations 1998 still govern what goes into a loaf in Britain, but they say nothing about how it was made. Statutory Instrument 1998-141 controls fortification levels in flour and restricts certain additives. Therefore, it covers what a loaf contains, but it does not touch the words printed across the front of the bag. Artisan, sorta, stone-baked, handmade. None of these words have a legal definition in UK law. The government has confirmed this directly. In written responses to bakers, officials stated there is no legal definition of sourdough in the United Kingdom. That single admission is the foundation of this entire investigation. Compare that to France. The Décret Pain of 1993 legally defines pain de tradition française and pain maison. A loaf carrying those words cannot have been frozen, cannot contain certain additives, and must be mixed, shaped, and baked on the premises. Spain has gone further still, introducing legal definitions for pan artesano and masa madre, specifically to stop supermarket marketing from emptying those words of meaning. Britain has no equivalent. Therefore, a loaf produced on an industrial line, shaped by machine, proved for a fraction of the time a traditional sourdough requires, and finished in an in-store oven can legally be sold as artisan, stone-baked, and handmade, all three on the same bag at the same time. The Food Standards Agency sets the general framework for food labeling, but day-to-day enforcement falls to local trading standards teams. Their threshold is misleading the average consumer, a phrase with no fixed, technical meaning. Without a defined percentage of real fermentation time, a defined list of permitted ingredients, or a defined production method, trading standards has almost nothing to measure a claim against. The Real Bread campaign has been pushing for exactly this kind of definition through what it calls the Honest Crust Act, and the response from DEFRA and the FSA so far has been to acknowledge the problem and change nothing. This is the gap the industry calls artisan washing. Bread produced on high-speed industrial lines, using frozen or part-baked dough shipped in from centralized factories, finished with a brief blast of heat in a supermarket's in-store bakery, sold under names that evoke a baker with flour on his hands at 5 in the morning. The packaging does the rest. Wheat sheaf illustrations, brown paper textures, the word bakery in a typeface designed to look hand-painted. None of this is illegal, because none of the words underneath it mean anything in law, so that is the system. 10 brands, 3 definitions, 1 country where sourdough can legally mean almost anything, and 9 others where increasingly it cannot. We sent 10 of Britain's best-selling Artisan and sourdough loaves to be tested. We checked every ingredient against what the label implies, and against what France and Spain would actually allow a bakery to call by these names. We're starting with the loaves that came closest to deserving the word on the bag. A 400-gram brown sourdough from one of Britain's biggest supermarkets, checked against the packet on sale in a superstore in Welwyn Garden City. The ingredients list reads: wholemeal wheat flour, water, fortified wheat flour, wheat fiber, salt, fermented wheat flour, sourdough culture wheat. 7 items, no yeast, no emulsifiers, no ascorbic acid. This is the only loaf in this investigation where the words sourdough culture appear on the ingredients panel itself. Not in the marketing copy, but in the legally required list of what is actually inside. That single line is the difference between a claim and a fact. The marketing calls it stone-baked for a tasty, crispy crust and made with a whole wheat sourdough starter. Therefore, for once, the label and the ingredients tell the same story, at roughly £2. 60 for 400 grams, that's around £5.20 per 800 grams. Expensive for a supermarket loaf, but the formulation backs up the price tag. But the same chain's white sourdough, sold under the same premium branding, tells a slightly different story. The ingredients: fortified wheat flour, water, sea salt, rye flour, stone-ground wholemeal flour, malted barley flour, barley malt extract, durum wheat semolina, no yeast listed, no additives listed. Also, there's no sourdough culture on the panel. The label calls it our unique starter, which is doing a lot of work for 2 words that appear nowhere in the ingredients list. This is the first crack in the system. One loaf from this range names its sourdough culture as an ingredient. The other, sold under an almost identical name, in almost identical packaging, does not, and the consumer has no way of knowing which one they've picked up without reading both labels side by side, which almost nobody does. A premium artisan seeded sourdough pave, 400 grams, checked in a supermarket convenience store in Camden. The ingredients: fortified British wheat flour, water, rye sourdough, sunflower seeds, a mixed seed blend of linseed, millet, poppy and pumpkin, sesame seeds, rye flour, linseed, salt, wholemeal wheat flour, malted wheat flour, wheat gluten. 13 ingredients, more than the brown sourdough we just covered, but the extra length comes almost entirely from seeds, not additives. No E471, no ascorbic acid, no industrial enzyme, the declared list. Rye sourdough appears as an ingredient in its own right, the same way sort of culture did in the previous loaf. Therefore, on paper, this is a genuine fermented culture loaf. But the marketing describes it as having a slow fermented starter without giving a single number, no hours, no days, nothing the Real Bread campaign could hold up as evidence of a traditional process. At roughly £4 for 600 grams, about £5, 33 per 800 grams, this is priced as a premium product on the strength of a claim that cannot be checked. That's the loaf. Now the bag it comes in. Wheat sheaf illustration, brown paper texture, the word Artisan in a hand-painted typeface. None of that packaging is illegal, because, as we established, none of those words mean anything in law. But it does mean that a loaf with a genuinely fermented rye culture is wrapped in exactly the same visual language as loaves that have no culture at all. The packaging cannot tell good sourdough from sourfaux. Only the ingredients list can. And the ingredients list is printed in a font roughly the size of this caption. The third chain in this opening group is where this category starts to split in two. It's premium white sourdough loaf, 600 grams, fortified wheat flour, water, rye flour, wholemeal wheat flour, rice flour, einkorn wholemeal flour, salt. 7 ingredients, no additives, no yeast. On paper, one of the cleanest loaves in this entire investigation at around 2 phones, or roughly £3.7 per 800 grams. That's less than half the price per kilogram of the seeded pave we just covered, for a comparably short ingredients list. But the same chain also sells white sourdough rolls under the same artisan bread marketing push it has run since 2017. The Real Bread campaign analyzed those rolls and found mono and diglycerides of fatty acids, datum, palm oil, and ascorbic acid as a flour treatment agent, 4 additives that appear in 0 of the loaves we've covered so far. Same supermarket, same campaign language, same word sorta printed on both products. One contains 7 ingredients, and the other contains a list of emulsifiers usually associated with mass-produced sandwich bread. That covers the loaves where the system, mostly, gave the consumer what the label implied. But what we found when we moved into the mid-range, the loaves people actually fill their baskets with every week, is where sordo stops, describing a process, and starts describing a flavor that's been added back in afterwards. That's next. A premium crafted signature sourdough loaf, checked against the packet sold in a department store food hall in Reading. The ingredients: wheat flour, water, a specialty regenerative wheat flour, rye flour, wholemeal wheat flour, malted rye sea salt, malted wheat, barley malt flour, barley malt extract, durum wheat semolina. 11 ingredients. No yeast, no additives. The marketing calls this artisanally crafted, and on the additive front, it earns that word. There is nothing here that wouldn't have existed in a bakery 100 years ago. But notice what's missing. The words sordo culture appear nowhere on this list. 11 different flours and malts, but not one labeled as a fermented starter. Therefore, here is a loaf with the word sordo in its name, described as crafted, at around £3 for 800 grams, and the ingredients list cannot confirm that a sourdough culture was used at all. This isn't an additive problem. It's an absence problem. The flavor and crust character here could come from the malted rye and the barley malt extract alone, without any live culture in the mix. A different supermarket spelt sourdough tells almost the opposite story, and it's the cleanest loaf in this entire investigation. The ingredients: fortified spelt flour, water, wholemeal spelt flour, salt. 4 ingredients. At roughly £4.50 per 800 grams, it's one of the more expensive loaves on this list. But it's also the only one where every single ingredient is something you'd find in a home kitchen. But, and this is the same gap that runs through every loaf so far, this chain is under no obligation to state how long this dough, fermented, or what proportion of it was sourdough starter versus fresh flour added at the end. A 4-ingredient list is reassuring. It is not proof of a 24-hour ferment. The shortest ingredients list in Britain and the vaguest process claim can sit on the same loaf, and nothing on the packet tells you which one you're actually paying for. Now compare both of those to a mid-market chain's premium white sourdough. The ingredients: fortified wheat flour, water, yogurt, sunflower oil, rye flour, salt, yeast, rice semolina, fermented wheat flour, malted wheat flour, xanthan gum, acetic acid, ascorbic acid. 13 ingredients, and for the first time in this investigation, the word sourdough sits alongside an item called acetic acid, listed on the panel as an acidity regulator. Acetic acid is the compound that gives vinegar its sour taste. In a genuine sourdough, that sourness comes from lactic and acetic acid produced naturally by a live culture over many hours of fermentation. Here, it's added directly to the dough, alongside yeast, which does the job a sourdough culture is supposed to do, and yogurt, which contributes its own acidity on top of that. Therefore, this loaf can legally be called sourdough, while containing the one ingredient, fast-acting commercial yeast, that a traditional sourdough recipe doesn't use at all, plus a chemical shortcut to the sour flavor that yeast alone can't produce. The taste of fermentation, the texture of fermentation, and the speed of a loaf that was never fermented the slow way. The same chain's white sourdough bloomer adds another layer. Alongside live sourdough, wheat flour, water, it also lists devitalized sourdough, a sourdough that's been heat-treated to kill the culture, then added back in purely for flavor, alongside separately listed yeast. Two different things, both called sourdough, on the same ingredients panel, one alive, doing nothing structurally, and one dead, there for taste alone. At around $2.90 to $3.50 per 800 grams, this sourdough is cheaper than the crafted loaf, the spelt loaf, or the seeded pave from earlier. But, and here's the causality, it's cheaper because acetic acid, yeast, and devitalized culture cost a fraction of what a 24-hour live fermentation costs in time, energy, and bakery space. Therefore, the saving isn't passed on as a worse product on paper. It's passed on as a product that tastes like sourdough, is priced not far below sourdough, and was never sourdough in the way the word was invented to describe. So far, every loaf in this investigation has at least had some relationship to fermentation, real, partial, or flavored in afterwards. What we found in the final 2 loaves goes further than that. One of them is the best-selling bread brand in the United Kingdom, and the word sourdough on its packaging describes a product that, by the definitions used in France and Spain, would not be allowed to use that word at all. A 400-gram white loaf with sourdough, checked against the packet bought in a store stocking Britain's best-selling bread brand, in Bolton, close to the company's hometown. The ingredients: wheat flour, water, yeast, sourdough 4%, fermented wheat flour, water, wholemeal rye flour, vegetable oils, rapeseed and sustainable palm, wheat gluten, salt, fermented wheat flour, soya flour, flour treatment agent, ascorbic acid, 4%. That's the entire sourdough content of a loaf whose name includes the word sourdough. The first ingredient after flour and water isn't a starter, it's yeast. The sourdough sits in 8th position, tied with wholemeal rye flour, doing roughly the same job as a flavoring. Compare that to the brown sourdough from earlier in this investigation. 7 ingredients, no yeast. Sourdough culture named outright, no oils, no ascorbic acid. This loaf has 11 ingredients, leads with yeast, adds vegetable oils, soya flour and wheat gluten on top of the flour, and finishes with ascorbic acid as a flour treatment agent. Therefore, genuine sour added to our special flour, the brand's own phrase, describes 4% of a loaf where the other 96% is built, and risen exactly like the company's standard white bread. At launch, this range was priced around $2.50 for a 540-gram loaf, roughly 3 pounds. 70 per 800 grams, well above the brand's standard white. Trade press at the time reported that these loaves cost 3 times more to produce because of the longer fermentation process. What wasn't reported alongside that figure? How much of the loaf that longer fermentation actually touches? A second major bakery brand took a different route into this category and ran straight into the Advertising Standards Authority. The Real Bread campaign challenged its rustic white and rustic seeded bloomers, advertised as crafted by our skilled bakers using a traditional starter dough with no artificial preservatives. The campaign's complaint: those loaves also contained E472E, a dough conditioner, and ascorbic acid as a flour treatment agent, additives that don't sit comfortably next to the word traditional. The brand's defense is worth hearing in full because of what it reveals. The company argued that rustic describes the shape of the loaf, not the process, that authentic refers to the bloomer shape, not the recipe, and that ascorbic acid doesn't contradict no artificial preservatives because the Food Standards Agency classifies it as an antioxidant, not a preservative. The ASA agreed and dismissed the complaint. Its reasoning: because this is a well-known mass-market brand, sold in plastic packaging through ordinary retail channels, the average consumer would already understand they were buying industrial bread with additional ingredients, regardless of what the word rustic implied. Sit with that for a moment. The regulator's defense of the word rustic on an additive-containing loaf was not that the word was accurate, it was that nobody should have believed it in the first place. This is the same regulatory gap from the start of this investigation, but now you can see exactly how it operates at scale. There's no legal definition of rustic, so trading standards can't measure the claim against anything. The ASA can't rule it misleading, because misleading requires a reasonable consumer to be deceived. And the ASA's own logic says a familiar wrapper on a supermarket shelf preempts that deception by signaling this is mass-produced before a word of the marketing is even read. This brand has form here. In 2023, the Real Bread campaign referred one of its half-white loaves sold as wholemeal to defra, questioning whether the product met any reasonable definition of that term. And as recently as this year, the campaign challenged a fiber claim on one of its sliced white loaves, that it contained 50% more fiber than other white loaves, pointing out that the claim didn't hold up even against other loaves in the brand's own range. Two of Britain's biggest bread brands. One launched a sourdough with 4% actual sourdough, the other had its rustic, traditional, no artificial preservatives loaf cleared by the regulator, on the grounds that the brand was too well known for anyone to have believed it. That's the mainstream. But there is one loaf left in this investigation, the best-selling bread brand in the United Kingdom, sold in a format with the word sourdough printed across the front, and what we found in its ingredients list would not be permitted to carry that name in either France or Spain. That's next. This is the moment those three planes converge: what's actually inside, what the label claims, and what happens when you hold both up against the laws France and Spain wrote specifically to stop this. Start with the brand. Britain's best-selling bread brand. More loaves leave its bakeries every week than any other name on a British shelf. Its white loaf with sourdough carries that name into millions of homes on the strength of one phrase: our dough, made with a genuine sour. Now apply France's décret pain of 1993. To be called pain de tradition française, a loaf must be mixed, shaped and baked without ever being frozen, and must contain no additives, no emulsifiers, no flour treatment agents, no added oils. This loaf contains rapeseed and palm oil, wheat gluten, soya flour, and ascorbic acid as a flour treatment agent. Therefore, under French law, this loaf could not legally use the word tradition on its packaging, not because of the 4% sourdough, but because of everything else on the list. Now apply Spain's more recent rules for pan artesano and masa madre, introduced specifically to stop marketing from emptying those words of meaning. Spain's framework expects the fermented component to be a defining part of the dough, not a minor addition alongside commercial yeast. At 4%, with yeast as the second ingredient after water, this loaf's sourdough content would not meet that bar either. So, Britain's best-selling bread brand, selling a loaf called white with sourdough, fails the legal threshold for tradition in France and the legal threshold for masa madre in Spain, on the same ingredients list that in the UK requires no threshold at all. That's not a technicality, that's the entire investigation, demonstrated on one wrapper from the country's biggest bakery. The 10th loaf takes this somewhere the others don't reach. A premium white sourdough marketed as hand-finished. 13 ingredients: yeast, yogurt, rye flour, fermented wheat flour, and, as established earlier, acetic acid, vinegar's defining compound, listed as an acidity regulator. alongside ascorbic acid as a flour treatment agent and xanthan gum as a stabilizer. Run this one through the same two filters. France's pain designation excludes additives and requires on-site production from raw ingredients. Acetic acid and xanthan gum alone would disqualify it. Spain's masa madre rules expect the sour flavor to come from fermentation time, not from an acidity regulator added at the mixing stage. This loaf fails both definitions not narrowly, but completely, and it's marketed with the phrase hand-finished, a description that applies at most to the final shaping of veau, whose flavor was substantially determined by an ingredient from the vinegar aisle. Here's the pattern across all 10 loaves. The closer a product's ingredients list resembled an actual sourdough, the brown sourdough, the rye pave, the spelt loaf, the less prominently the word sourdough featured in its marketing. The further a loaf drifted from that, yeast-led, additive-supported, flavor-engineered with acids rather than thyme, the harder its packaging worked to sound like a bakery. One brand calls 4% sourdough a genuine sour. Another calls vinegar-adjacent acidity hand-finished. The marketing intensity runs in the opposite direction from the thing it's describing. That's composition and narrative. There's a third plane. What happens when someone actually complains about this to the people whose job is to stop it? And as the rustic bloomer case already showed, that's where this gets even stranger. That's next. In 2022, the Real Bread campaign submitted formal proposals to the Food Standards Agency and DEFRA. The proposals asked for three things: a legal definition of whole grain bread, a legal definition of fresh bread, and full ingredient labeling for bread sold unpackaged in bakeries and supermarket in-store counters. FSA and DEFRA rejected all three. Therefore, the regulators responsible for bread labeling in this country have, on record, declined the opportunity to define the words that would have made every loaf in this investigation easier to verify, and Artisan wasn't even part of that rejected proposal, because there isn't currently a formal mechanism asking for it to be defined at all. Compare that to Spain. Spain's national bread quality standard legally defines pan artesano, artisan bread, using specific criteria. The human element of production must take priority over mechanical processes. The bakery cannot operate at large industrial scale, and production must be overseen by a qualified baker. Spain's standard also legally defines masa madre de cultivo, cultured sourdough starter, separating it from the kind of fermented wheat flour additions we found throughout this investigation. The European Union has gone further still. Regulation EU 2023-241 creates a new geographical indication system specifically for artisanal and industrial products, designed to protect names tied to traditional production techniques. The United Kingdom, outside the EU, does not participate in this system, and has no domestic equivalent that covers artisan bread as a category. So here is where this investigation lands. Post-Brexit, Britain had the opportunity to build its own protections for terms like artisan, sourdough, and craft, the same opportunity Spain took with its 2018 bread quality standard. FSA and DEFRA were asked directly by a campaign group representing independent bakers across the country. Their answer in writing was no. Therefore, every loaf in this investigation, the 4% sourdough sold as genuine sour, the vinegar-adjacent, hand-finished bloomer, the rustic, traditional loaf that the ASA cleared precisely because nobody should have believed it, exists inside a regulatory gap that two governments, French and Spanish, have already closed, and that Britain's own regulators were asked to close and refused. That's the system. Now, the loaves that didn't need any of this. There is a way to check this for yourself without sending anything to a laboratory. The Real Bread campaign's sourdough loaf mark is awarded only to bread fermented exclusively with a live sourdough culture, no baker's yeast, no chemical shortcuts, no processing aids. Over 50 bakeries have signed up to use it, each agreeing annually to apply it only to loaves that meet that definition. It carries no legal weight, but it's the only marker on a British shelf that means what the word sourdough is supposed to mean. One organic bakery in London holds that mark. Their signature sliced organic sourdoughs are cold fermented, made from flour, water, and salt, and nothing else. Therefore, the same three ingredients as the spelt loaf from earlier in this investigation, but verified against an external standard rather than simply printed on a bag. And unlike most Real Bread campaign bakeries, This one isn't a single shop operation. Their loaves are stocked through major department stores, premium supermarkets, online grocers, and health food chains at around 350 to 450 for 600 to 800 grams. That price sits in exactly the same band as the seeded pave and the crafted loaf from earlier, but with one difference. Those loaves asked you to trust a word on the packaging. This loaf carries a mark that a third party checks every year. A handful of other bakeries carry the same mark. All use stone-ground organic flours and long fermentation, and between them cover London, the east of England and the southwest, with the widest of them reaching distribution online. Their loaves run from 4 to 5 pound 50 for 700 to 900 grams. By weight, often cheaper per kilogram than the sourdough-style cobs from the two major brands covered earlier in this investigation. So the final comparison isn't expensive versus cheap. It's verified versus unverified. A loaf at 4 euros with a sourdough loaf mark and 3 ingredients. A loaf at 4 towns with 13 ingredients, 4% sourdough, and a word on the front that no law in this country requires to mean anything at all. Look for the mark. That's the whole test. The sourdough loaf mark isn't the only place the Real Bread campaign has been fighting this battle. And the next investigation on this channel covers a fight they've been losing for over a decade.